Yeah.
New class.
Come on.
Old
It's
school.
for the
Yeah.
old school.
Look. And how we
Green
living out
ass
there.
twin.
I got a plan, sorta. All I need is one mic and a camcorder. You might have heard of luck. If you never did, you should turn this up.
Let go.
And take a good listen to the street knowledge that the hood missing. I got a plan, sorta. All I need is one mic and a camcorder.
Thank you for joining us again. My name is Christian Cole, Vice President of the Student African American Brotherhood, and I'd like to introduce you to our episode 3, which is a continuation of our previous conversation of our video podcast series, Men in 10. So first of all, we talked about a lot of subjects last time, but we didn't have enough to we didn't get in depth in the situation because it's such a complex issue, multifaceted issue. That is, we could talk for days, but we have 10 minutes.
10 minutes.
So we're going to talk about opening with the war on drugs. We spoke about that previously with President Ronald Reagan's war on drugs and the specific legislation that made it so that black men were targeted at a higher proportion than white men. And a lot of that has to do with the criminalization of specific drugs that were more prevalent in certain communities. So we can look at it today, because it still goes on. We have our opioid versus weed conflict right now. Many people were locked up previously for the 3 strikes rule for weed infractions. There's many people in jail for weed now, but we're seeing the legalization of weed in states like California, Colorado, and it's becoming a business that we have people in jail, sitting in jail for life, 40 years, for something that is now being legalized. So we now see issues in places like Staten Island where the opioid addiction is becoming a real problem, but we're not seeing it reported and enforced by police as much as we saw weed in the past. So what are your feelings on that?
I think it comes down to, you're definitely talking about the magnitude and like the target populations of where like these drugs, who's using these drugs and where they're being used. If you go back and you look at the war on drugs era, there's that dichotomy of crack versus cocaine. Now, both of these substances originated from the same form. They took different physical manifestations and where they were distributed in certain communities. So you can look at it legally through the piece of legislation, the regulations on crack were a lot more stricter than they were on cocaine. And the people who were using cocaine were often Caucasian Americans, and the people who were most often using crack were African Americans. So with the 3 strikes law and things like mandatory minimum sentencing really had a detrimental effect on the black community and led to that whole era of mass incarceration. But looking at it in the sort of the modern day era, you're seeing the same problem, that where these drugs are being used correlates very strongly with race and their prevalence, and the possible detriments that the entire society could have as a whole. Would be a lot more detrimental if you focused on the opioid crisis and who are using these drugs and what sort of societal figures are probably using these drugs as opposed to weed on the other end of the spectrum.
Absolutely. So you can see that just monetary value also plays a part in that. Like you said, crack and cocaine, one is cheaper, one is a lot more expensive. And one is a higher quality, one is a lower quality. It can be cut with other products and multiplied. And you can see that the communities, majority who is spending money for crack, lower income communities who tend to be higher populations with people of color, and versus the white communities who have higher resources, economic resources to purchase items such as cocaine and now even opioids. And we're not seeing those being criminalized, even though they're just as damaging, just as dangerous, just as infectious. They're not being criminalized as much as these other drugs are, and you can look at it as a systemic racist issue for that driving force behind that. And so another thing we want to talk about is life sentences or even minimum sentencing for certain crimes that you even spoke about. And I just wanted to hear your thoughts on that, William.
I mean, I kind of actually wanted to go back to the systematic institution of like the dichotomy between the drugs, because kind of one thing that I kind of want to add to that is I think a lot of it is also, it's not like, all right, we're targeting black people because they're doing this. I think a lot of it is due to, implicit bias and a lot of like connection, we draw connections to things we see. So I think a lot of it is, it's about who's doing the drugs, but it's not necessarily targeting. It'll be like, all right, we see this and we correlate with it. We correlate this with black people, and we correlate black people with criminals. Therefore, this is dangerous. It goes from A to B to C, and people make that connection and feel like something has to be done about it. Versus if it's like a whole bunch of people, like like I say, rich white people doing something that they're not perceived in the media as a danger, so we'll have less attention to that.
Okay.
So sorry to kind of sidestep
No,
the
that's
question
fine.
you asked, but I kind of wanted to go back to that.
We love the open ideas, and I appreciate your perspective. So thank you for sharing that. So now we're going to go into police brutality, because we talked about that previously, and that's an issue that further complicates the ideas and realities of being a black male. So what are some thoughts on police brutality today?
Today, I think it's an endemic issue that's not being addressed. A lot of people are worried about, and they talk about in the news, like the concept of like Second Amendment rights and our entitlement to self-defense. But I think in the greater context, it's just the right to existence and not constantly be impeded when a subpopulation of a country feels so targeted by a mechanism that's meant to protect and sort of enforce the law, when it seems, and it's being portrayed constantly, that they're never the victim. They're always the criminal. They're always the agitator of the issue. What we see with the police brutality is a lot of these end up being very young African-American men who are targeted because they're seen as the most probable cause of danger. And all of these killings and brutal beatings are displayed across the media and the internet without any restraint. And the mental health effect that these instances have is absolutely detrimental to those who never encounter the police brutality directly in and of themselves, but they see it and they visualize it happening to their peers. And it's extremely detrimental and damaging to the black youth and even adult black men as well.
Absolutely. So you pointed that it's extremely detrimental and extremely damaging to both mental health, physical health, and also your self-identity. So like we talked about in our previous segment, we mentioned the double consciousness. So being educated black men as we are moving through society, it reminds me of a quote that James Baldwin said, to be black and conscious in America is to be in a constant state of rage. And so how do we feel as though we are aware that we are portrayed one way, we are perceived one way, but we are also who we are. So now we're balancing these two ideas. I want to be who I am, but I also have to be conscious of the way people are seeing me. And how does that relate to or even manifest itself in other aspects of life? So specifically, now we can talk for ourselves. Being that we're at a college, we're a prestigious university, predominantly white institution, Stony Brook University. How does these factors manifest themselves in higher education? You can speak specifically to your experiences.
So it's like educationally, I think walking into a classroom, there's a barrier that you have to cross through and get through when you're speaking to professors, TAs, and things of that nature, of having to sort of deconstruct and not necessarily decriminalize in this aspect. You have to break through a lot of the stereotypes that are attached to you. It can feel like that there's this stereotypical perception that every black or even Latino students are lobbed into this the educational opportunity program and all the unfortunately negative connotations that are associated with that, and you have to battle through that perception that, okay, you're coming from a low-income area, your high school education probably wasn't that good, and you're only coming here on some affirmative action opportunity when you're really just going there to ask a question, and you have the totality of the academia in your mind. You're just there as yourself.
Yeah.
So kind of one thing I want to say about that is, I think it's like there's two factors that come into that. A lot of it is, how other people perceive you and, how like the reality of that. But another thing is the reality of how you feel people perceive you. Because one interesting thing about that is, like, I hear and I understand that. But for me as a black man, maybe this is because I grew up in an all-white community or a predominantly white community, is lots of these barriers I don't necessarily readily like feel. Like when I go in, I don't feel like, oh, they must think this or they must think that. I feel like I'm more just presenting myself because I feel like, I guess like I feel like I have control over my identity. I've struggled with things in the past, but I've come to a point where I try not to put myself into a box. I believe that I have that control. you know, I can't control what someone else may think of me, you know, but I can control how I think of myself. So I feel like a lot of it is like, all right, like it is true that someone may think things of you, but also do you think things of yourself and do you project that?
Yeah.
That's kind of why.
Definitely. So with that being said, we're going to wrap up today's segment, but we are going to continue this conversation. It's a fruitful conversation, and I believe that a lot of ideas are being expressed here. And so we'd ask you guys to join us for our next session where we will continue this conversation. Thank you.
All I need is one mic and a camcorder.